Hi everyone, I hope you guys are all having a great day. Today I'm going to do my first video review for my Read Alaska project. So in the month of July, I read Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. So I'm going to start by saying this review will contain spoilers because it's more of a discussion than a review. So if you haven't read the book yet, I would definitely encourage you to hit the pause button and go read the book. It won't take you very long. It's pretty short. I'm going to do an overview of the story, and then I'm going to talk about my general reactions to the book. So that's how I've decided I'm going to structure this. In Into the Wild, Jon Krakauer examines the life of Chris McCandless, who is a young man who decides to separate himself from his family and from society as a whole in order to live a more purpose-driven life. For Chris McCandless, that means living a life where you're in nature and living a life for other people, dedicated to loving and helping others. He feels that his family and American society in general does not value any of those things, so he is separating himself in order to go and experience those things on his own. He sort of tramps around the United States for a couple of years and then finally sets his sights on Alaska. So he hitchhikes up to Alaska along the Alaskan Highway, which goes through Canada and then into Alaska and down into Fairbanks. And he hitchhikes that whole way. He gets dropped off at the trailhead where he decides he wants to hike, and he hikes in about 20 miles to an area where there is an old abandoned bus. I believe this bus was there for an old building project, but the building project was abandoned and they left the bus there as a wilderness shelter for hikers and hunters who might end up needing it. McCandless spends about 4 months out there. He is living off the land as best he can, and he is found 4 months later at the beginning of September dead in the bus. That's the basics of the story. Krakauer digs into this story and gives you a look at McCandless' background from his childhood all the way up to the day that he died. And then Krakauer also gives you a look at other explorers and people who sort of lived their lives similarly to McCandless did, who had similar values to McCandless. Krakauer looks at his own life and his own experiences, as well as all of the evidence, to give us a fuller picture of who Chris McCandless was. The real question I think Krakauer wants us to ask is, is this guy suicidal? Is that why he goes out into the Alaskan wilderness by himself, ill-prepared? Is this guy an arrogant fool who went out into the Alaskan wilderness unprepared and thought that he could handle it? Or is Chris McCandless a complex human being who is arrogant and stubborn and impetuous, but is also kind and loving and just trying to live a life that is full of purpose? I think Jon Krakauer definitely favors the latter view of McCandless. After reading the entire book, I think I'm in agreement with him, and I want to talk a little bit about why that is. Chris McCandless was raised in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. His father was a big shot scientist at NASA, and then ended up doing some opened a contracting business that has to do with satellites. I don't fully understand that job. You can look it up if you are more interested in that. And so Chris McCandless is raised in a fairly well-to-do family. They seemed and were a fairly happy, normal American family. His parents were very driven and very successful, and they wanted Chris to be successful in the typical American view of success. They expected him to go to college and go to law school, and he could help people that way. And I want to note that that is a viable option. Getting a good education and using your skills and that good education to help people is 100% a good thing to do with your life. So don't take this review as a suggestion that you shouldn't do that. Just Chris McCandless did not want to do that. During his college experience, he became more disconnected from his family. In high school and in college, he would often spend his time in the harder, more rougher parts of the city, going out and feeding homeless people, for instance. So his focus really was on, in those years, it really was on helping people in tangible ways. And he thought that was what he wanted to do with his life. But about halfway through college, he goes on a trip out west to visit, and he ends up visiting his father's ex-wife and his half-siblings. And during that trip, he finds out that his father's divorce and remarriage it wasn't as cut and dry as you might hope. That his father was actually married to his ex-wife, having a full-on affair, and had these dual families the whole time. And Chris just is completely overwhelmed by that knowledge. He cannot handle the sins of his father, and I think that many of us experience that. We all eventually have to deal with the humanity of our parents. They are not perfect. No human is perfect, especially not by the standards that we hold ourselves to, and I think it's always difficult when a child realizes that about their parents. But Chris's adventurous personality, his stubbornness, his intense will, and the innate differences between him and his family, when you pile on the sins of your father bit, it separated him from his family. He couldn't handle it. He didn't want to handle it. So he basically stopped. He wasn't in communication with his parents very much for the rest of his college career. And then when he graduated from Emory University, his parents expected him to, spend the summer doing what he wanted and then go to law school. Well, that's not what Chris did. Chris graduated, donated what was left of his savings account, which was about $25,000, and he donated it to an organization that fed homeless people. And then he got in his car and he left, and he did not speak to anybody in his family ever again. We don't know if he would have eventually come back to his family or not. All we know is that in those 3 years, he did not. So from Atlanta, Georgia, where his university was, he travels all over the United States, predominantly in the West, and the Midwest and the Western regions, even going down into Mexico on a canoe. So he lived a very unconventional life for those few years while he is traveling. First he's in his car, but then he doesn't follow road signs because he is an impetuous young man, and young people, this happens. So he's out west, near a lake in the desert, and he decides that he wants to take his car off-road, despite the fact that there are signs all over the place telling him not to. He parks his car basically in a ditch, but that ditch is actually an old stream bed, and when a flash flood comes along, because that's what happens in the desert, and his car basically gets bogged down by water and mud. He can't get the car to start, so he leaves it. He abandons it. The car's actually fine. All he had to do was wait for it to dry out and get a new battery, and he would have been able to start the car again, but he's an impetuous, impatient young man. So he leaves the car, and off he goes. Now he's a real hitchhiker, and he hitchhikes, like I said, all across the country. There are times where he's a little bit more settled, where he spends a couple of weeks to almost a month or so with certain people. He actually built strong relationships with people during that time, relationships that he felt and that were very genuine with the people that he met during his travels. After a couple of years of traveling like this, he decides that he is going to go to Alaska. He hitchhikes up to Alaska, and the only thing that he has with him is a backpack with like a 10-pound bag of rice, Kmart boots, a jacket, and a .22 rifle. And for those of you who don't like hunt and things, a .22 rifle is not going to get you anything. You can typically hunt like squirrels and other small animals with a .22. It's not going to protect you from a grizzly bear, for instance. If you stumble across one in the Alaskan wilderness, all it's going to do is piss the bear off, and you're probably going to die. So when when he runs into Alaskans who see him with his 10-pound bag of rice and his 22, and that's it, they think of him as an idiot, a fool who had no idea what he was doing. That's not necessarily the best view to have of Chris McCandless, though, because he makes these decisions on purpose. He felt like if he could survive the deserts of the southwest United States, if he can survive those experiences that he had in the past, he felt that he could definitely survive one summer in Alaska. And I think that we can all understand that pride and arrogance of being young. It just comes with the territory, thinking that you couldn't possibly die. You couldn't possibly become overwhelmed by the experience that you're about to undertake. So he hitchhikes in, and he decides to go to a trail called the Stampede Trail. This is a trail in the northern regions of just north of Denali National Park. It's near Healy, Alaska. So he gets a ride to the trailhead. The guy who drives him out there is a super sweet man. He gives him his Extra Tough, which are these boots that Alaskans like to wear. He gives him the food he has left over in his car, and he thinks he's worried about Chris McCandless, but he's worried about him. He doesn't think he's going to be able to make it, and he gives him these things to help him survive, which is really, really sweet, and just a caring, wonderful thing for this man to do. He drops Chris off. Chris now hikes into the wilderness. He has to cross the Teklanika River, which runs into Denali National Park. In April, he's doing this in April. In April in Alaska, there are still feet of snow on the ground, but the river is flowing. So he has to cross the river, and he crosses the river, and then he hikes out into the rest of the trail, and he finds this abandoned bus, and he lives in the bus for a little while. He explores the area around, and he has a successful wilderness experience for about 3 months. He then decides that, his time in the wilderness is over. He's going to go back. We think he was going to go back to help a friend finish a farming project down in the lower 48. That's where he said that he was going to be. But when he goes to cross, he hikes the 10 miles back to the Teklanika River, and the problem is the river is flooded. When Chris crossed it in April, it might have been up to his waist or so, but by the end of July, the river is flooded with snow melt from the surrounding mountain ranges, and it's way too high to cross. Now, if Chris had brought a map, he might know that there were 2 other viable crossing points not far from where he was, but Chris didn't bring a map. This, to me, is the biggest mistake he made, and one that I will not allow any excuses for. It's just silly. Bring a map when you go hiking, especially when you know that you're going by yourself. It's hubris. It's something that I can't get over. But anyway, he doesn't have a map, so he doesn't know that there are 2 other viable crossing points within 2 miles of the spot where he is. So he decides, well, I can't cross the river. I'm going to go back to my campsite, and I'll just try to make the hike again in a couple of weeks. Hopefully the water will be lower. But he ends up having a difficult time continuing to find food. He had successfully hunted with his .22 rifle. He got squirrels and small birds and even bagged a small moose during his time at the bus at the end of the Stampede Trail. He wasn't able to keep that moose meat because he tried to smoke it, but it didn't work because he didn't really have the materials that he needed, so all of the meat went to waste, and he was really frustrated with that experience. For many reasons, because he was hungry, but also because that meant that he wasted the life of an animal, which was a very difficult thing for him to come to terms with. So he has small animals that he's feeding off of, and he's also eating roots and berries. The roots that he was eating are a root called wild potato plant. And by the middle of the summer, those roots are too tough to eat, so he started eating the seeds of the plant. All of the books that he had said that this was a totally fine thing to do, because until this experience, we thought that it was a totally fine thing to do, eat the seeds of the plant. People ate the root, why wouldn't they be able to eat the seeds? Well, it turns out that they are incredibly poisonous to humans, and they cause a kind of paralysis. And Chris didn't know this. Honestly, nobody except some Nazi scientists knew it, which I'll get to a little later. And he poisons himself by eating this huge bag of seeds that he has collected. He poisons himself to the point that he is paralyzed. He can barely walk. And he is really, really struggling. You can see in his diaries this. He leaves short diary entries at this point because he didn't bring journals or writing papers. He forgot them, so he's writing in the back of a plant book. And you can see him saying that he's injured, that he's hungry, that he doesn't have any energy, and he's having an incredibly difficult time even walking to get berries. And so he cannot walk out. He cannot hike out of the wild like he thought that he would be able to. And so because he can't walk, because he can't move, he ends up starving to death in the bus where he had made his camp. And a couple of, I think like 19 days after he starves to death, a couple of moose hunters come out and find his remains in the bus. So that's the general overview of the story. I'm going to now talk about some things that I liked about it, some things that I struggled with while reading it, and then my final thoughts. I really enjoyed Jon Krakauer's writing. I think he did an excellent job of researching Chris McCandless' life and then narrating it so that you get a full picture of who this young man was. I think it's wrong to stereotype this young man as a fool who went into the wild unprepared. If we look at his whole story, we can see that that's not necessarily true. Krakauer also did a great job of comparing Chris McCandless to other people who have lived and enjoyed, who have lived in the wild, and who are driven by that urge to be in the wild. I buddy read this with Amelia Reeds, that's her YouTube channel, and she, when she was reading it, she was very interested in how our society views success. There are people who do these crazy things all the time. You know, adventurers who go out and climb dangerous mountains or spend months and weeks in the wilderness, and they survive. Because they survive, they're touted as heroes, but if they fail, they are called fools. And that is especially true in a place like Alaska, where where Alaskans are pretty harsh on anybody who comes into their country. And you can see that in the story, but I also have experienced it in real life, living up here as they love their state. They're so proud of their state. It's one of the coolest places in the United States, but they think it's the best place in the world. And for anybody to come into their territory unprepared, it's an atrocity. So, and I say that with love, any fellow Alaskans who watch this video. But Krakauer does a good job of explaining the full story and comparing Chris McCandless to other explorers and adventurers, including Krakauer himself. There's a great chapter in the book where Krakauer gives his own experience as a young man about his own separation from his father, his desire and achievements climbing incredibly difficult mountains, including Devil's Thumb in Alaska, in which you climb up a glacier, travel on an ice field, and then climb up an incredibly dangerous mountain. Krakauer explains his motivation for doing that, how he achieved it despite unbelievably dangerous circumstances, and then how he felt after he achieved that goal, whether or not it changed his life like he thought it would. And I think that's what Chris McCandless' thought process was as well. Chris thought that this experience would change his life, and it did. You can see his perspective and his thoughts and ideas solidifying through his experience in the wild. And it really just breaks my heart not to know the man that he would have become had he been able to hike out of the Alaskan wilderness. I also want to add that more than anything, more than Krakauer's writing, the things that helped humanize McCandless for me are the pictures that we have from McCandless' journeys. He took a camera with him and he photographed himself through all of his different experiences, and you can see his face. You can really get a great understanding of who he was during his experiences, and he wasn't a harsh person. He said some harsh things, especially about his parents, but he was just a young man, and I think that he really deserves our compassion more than our judgment. It breaks my heart to see some of the pictures. I'm not going to put them in the video because I don't know, photo right or copyright laws. I don't know if I can, but I would definitely encourage you to look up Chris McCandless' actual photographs from this journey. They are worth your time. And some of them are just heartbreaking. That he's happy when he shoots two porcupines. Porcupines are stinky animals, but I guess they're food for him. He needed to eat. So you can just see the joy that he's experiencing as he is living in the wild. He's not suicidal. He's not upset. He's not angry. He is enjoying this experience, and it really helped just solidify that view that Krakauer is trying to portray of Chris McCandless, a view that I think is accurate. The last thing I want to share are two quotes from Chris McCandless directly. The first one is after Chris was poisoned, he was having trouble walking, but he needed to go and get food for himself. So he's out gathering berries, and he knows that he's close to death. He knows that he needs help at this point. So he leaves a note on the bus where he's staying, just in case anybody stumbles across him. And this is what it says. It says, "SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless." And it's dated August with a question mark. This is interesting for all kinds of reasons, but it strikes me as so powerful because it just again shows that he wanted to live. He did not go out into the wild in an attempted suicide. He wanted to live and experience his life to the fullest, but because of a simple mistake, he did not survive. And then the last note that he wrote in his journals is just a short little sentence that I think, again, proves that point. And he says, "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye and may God bless all." So again, I just think this shows that he wanted to survive. He was happy with the life that he had lived. He wasn't depressed. He wasn't insane. He wasn't suicidal. He was a young man struggling with the world as we know it, but that is part of the human experience. And I really, really appreciated Krakauer showing us this whole picture of the young man, Chris McCandless, experiencing or trying to deal with this human existence. So overall, I thought this was a wonderful book. I gave it 4 stars. I do think that Chris McCandless was a foolhardy, stubborn, arrogant young man, but that's not all he was. And Jon Krakauer wrote this book to show us that there was so much more to him and to his life and his ambitions, and I think that Krakauer absolutely succeeded. So this was a long, rambly video, but it's an excellent book, and I would definitely recommend it. If you have read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.